Hello and welcome to the Partnership Projects NVR Podcast, Season 3. This is podcast number 7. I'm Shila Desai.
And I'm Peter Jakob.
And today's theme, Peter, it's just simple. It's war.
Yeah, we had a conversation beforehand, didn't we? And I guess it's almost impossible given the conflict that is surging in the Middle East currently to talk about anything else, particularly on a podcast that is devoted to nonviolent resistance and nonviolence.
Yeah, I think, Peter, I think today's podcast is really kind of honouring what's going on the global stage. And if we think about the origins of NVR, it came from Israel, in terms of the treatment intervention for families. And we're thinking about our colleagues and friends, in Israel, but also in Gaza. And I think today's podcast is really to honour that. So, yeah, I think it's hard to think of anything else at the moment.
Yeah. And there's so many thoughts, impressions, memories that seem to tumble around in one's mind. And I guess personally, I feel haunted by certain images. One that has been with me over the last few days is of the German Jewish mother who has been begging Hamas to hand over her daughter's body. And I can't get that out of my mind. And the other one is of a dear friend who had been able to travel for the first time in her life and who got back to Gaza and who said that she was glad to be back in Gaza so that if her children die, she will die with them. And that will not leave me. Those words, they've sort of burned themselves into my mind and my feelings.
As you're talking, Peter, there's also a sense that this podcast could be seen as an act of resistance. We're thinking about our friends, families in Gaza, where there is very little electricity right now and access to the outside world, and that perhaps they may get a chance to listen to this as well as a way of reaching them too, and that we are here. We are in pain too. We are suffering together.
Yes.
We're not there, but we are suffering together.
Yeah. They are not alone, though they often feel they are alone and cut off. And I have dear friends in Israel, and I have dear friends in Gaza. And it is so painful to see what is happening. And another aspect that struck me, I was watching the BBC last night, and I forget the name of the journalist. He was asking an Israeli officer very probing questions. And then in another interview, he was asking a Hamas official very probing questions. And both men got angry at him. And I was struck by how the anger crowds out anything, including the really important questions that journalist was asking.
Can you say a little bit more about the questions the journalist was asking? Because,
he was asking the Hamas official whether there was any justification for the massacre or the massacres that were carried out. He was asking him questions about the hostages that had been taken, children, women, non-combatant men. And the Hamas official was very angry and told him that he was asking the wrong questions. And he was asking the Israeli officer whether he felt that the strike, the bombing of Gaza and whatever ground intervention or invasion Israel may be planning was likely, in his view, to achieve the objective of alienating the Gazan population from Hamas. And the Israeli officer got angry at him as well. And yet these are such important questions. They go to the heart of the matter. And I felt that the heart of the matter cannot be addressed. And perhaps when we think of this podcast as being a tiny act of resistance, perhaps it is resistance to the inability to address these questions, such questions.
And what I'm hearing and what you're talking about, Peter, is those questions that are asked on the ground there, directly to those who are in combat with each other. And you talk about two men representing two different opposing parties.
Yeah.
Asking questions to them that is leading to further escalations. And what I'm hearing is a loss of what really matters is the people on both sides, the women, the children, the families who are not party to these opposing views. And those matters are not being heard.
Yes. I was thinking of a conversation yesterday on Women's Hour about male violence, about rape, abduction of women as a means of carrying out warfare. We could also speak of starving of women, of children, as a means of carrying out warfare. It is the violence of men that is another issue here, an age-old issue. And what also strikes me is are the words "yes, but." You know that I'm largely of German descent. And when I first came to Germany in the late 60s, I was asking Germans of the generation that came before about the Holocaust, the Shoah. And my questions didn't get answers because very quickly there were responses such as, yes, that was wrong. But you know what the Russians did? The Russians did this. The Russians raped our women. The Russians did this and that. Or what about the bombing of Hamburg? What about the bombing of Dresden? Were those not also war crimes? And what really strikes me is that the yes, but wipes out the silence that must come. You know, there must be a silence where one witnesses the horrors. The Hamas officials, yes, but you're asking the wrong questions. Think of all the suffering that the Palestinians have had. The yes but wipes out the silence that must come when we think of the horrors of the massacres. And then there is the actual suffering that Palestinians have experienced and the indignities and injustices over decades. So there must be room for all that, and there must be silence after each testimony. And when it comes to yes, but, there is a kind of comparison that is coming in. It's as if to say, well, but we are not as bad as the others, or the others are pretty bad too. So don't accuse us of being bad people. And the comparison detracts from responsibility. And to me, there's this question of what responsibility do I have for making peace? Or am I blinded by rage and my wish for retaliation? And I'm thinking of so many examples. I'm thinking of September 11. The way initially so many sympathies flowed towards the United States and towards New York City, and how those sympathies evaporated when we went into Afghanistan and waged a war which was initially successful against the Taliban, but never invested in building up or helping to build up the country, never invested in peacemaking in terms of creating infrastructure, in terms of helping that country get on its feet. Instead, we divested our energies into waging yet another war in Iraq, for which there was no justification, and which served political purposes I don't understand, perhaps served the purpose of boosting ego. Yet, what is needed is peace building. And I guess it's a long time ago, in the 1990s, when Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin were beginning to talk peace. And I heard on the radio someone saying these were strong leaders. We don't have strong leaders in that area now. And I remember scenes of young Palestinian men and boys waving Israeli flags. I think that's forgotten. So somewhere there are voices in people, strong voices that are often not heard, but that call for peace. And the responsibility, I think, for peacemaking and the guilt that people incur when they neglect peacemaking is something that I would want to see at the forefront of conversations, rather than attributing a monocausal origin of the problem.
What I hear you saying, Peter, very eloquently and, in real depth, if I can simplify, in a sense, what you're saying is that we must learn from the past, must learn from the mistakes, significant, horrific atrocities that have happened. And when you talked about that kind of silence and that space, we talk a lot about that in our work in NVR, those moments of stillness, stillness in the chaos, the the quote about Viktor Frankl about from that moment that we can choose a response in that silence.
Yeah.
That almost that real desperate need for some stillness, and what we're not having that, are we? The escalation in terms of support from other countries, nations for each side of the party is there's no room for silence but what I've also heard you talk about is exceptions and moments where it has been possible for unification, between Yasser Arafat and that moment. I'm thinking about the Northern Ireland peace treaty as well. Those moments of conversations, and I was recently at a systemic AFT conference where Jo Berry spoke about how she and Patrick Magee, who had bombed Brighton and killed her father, the journey that she took in building bridges with Patrick Magee by saying that what kind of stories can we tell of ourselves in order that we can continue to live together. And she described the concept of unbounded empathy, which was a risk for her because she made a huge quest over 20 plus years to reconcile and have dialogue with Patrick Magee at the cost to her own family. That her own family saw her connection to Patrick Magee as a betrayal.
So they saw her as a
traitor, as she was meeting the enemy. And what she talked about was how she had to resist those in order to be able to create stories of how we continue to live together with this. And I was just inspired by, in that silence, if there is moments of prayer or solace for our families, and in Gaza and Israel and across the world, the suffering. How can we build that peace, and hope for change? I guess that's what I'm kind of just resonating for me as you're talking.
I'm curious because I'm thinking of the courage it takes, and what you're bringing into the conversation is a wonderful example of peace building, isn't it?
Peace building, yeah.
So I'm thinking of the courage that it takes, and I wonder how did she resist? How did she resist the condemnation of her family that she was in some way consorting with the enemy?
I guess one of the things that I heard was her painful journey, and I am not in any way saying this is what needs to happen right now. This is her story after 20 plus years of struggle, that she moved to a point where she was saying that if I was in his shoes, would I have done the same? If I knew what was happening in Northern Ireland and that idea of there is no side, there is just a need for valid stories to be heard.
And she was sharing that with her family.
Yeah.
There's something in my own life that I've been thinking about a lot in recent months. Don't know why it's come up in recent months. And that is when I was a boy at junior high school, middle school. I was being bullied by another boy who was bigger and stronger. And the source and the quality of his bullying was largely to humiliate me. It was physical, but it was physical to humiliate me. And I built up a helpless hatred of him. And at some point, he did something that led to me giving in to my rage. And I tackled him on the stairs coming up from recess in the school. And I had my hands around his neck. And I know I wanted to kill him. And that's very frightening to see that in oneself. And, thank goodness it was in a public place. And I was pulled off by a teacher. I was never punished. I don't know why. But I know that my rage felt boundless. So there is a sense that I am capable, potentially, or was capable at least at that point, of doing something terrible. So I don't even like it when perpetrators of the worst kinds of crimes, like we've seen, like the horrific massacre of the young people at the music festival, the children and families at that kibbutz. I do not like it when they are called animals.
Yeah.
Even these perpetrators, it's a small step from calling them animals to calling their kin, or at least seeing their kin as animals, seeing their nation as animals.
Mm-hmm.
And from there, it's another small step to doing whatever one feels is justified in self-protection. I think the silence and what you've just referred to as boundless empathy means that we must contemplate the suffering of people before anything else. And I'm thinking of the Buddhist ethos, which is not very rule-bound, but which calls for compassion with the suffering of all sentient beings. And I think that boundless empathy, that word that you use, it is necessary in building peace. And there is a responsibility of all those in power to build peace. And when they do not build peace, they are guilty of neglect. And it's out of this neglect that such horror grows. So, and I think, in working with NVR in families and in the responses parents show to children, I like to make the distinction between holding accountable and holding responsible. I would like to help parents to hold their children responsible for future acts, not so much to hold them accountable for what they have done. Mm-hmm. The latter, when it comes to nonviolence, is not as important as the former. And I'm thinking of our colleagues with whom we are working in Gaza, in Bridges for Hope and Peace, who are working with families in which the larger violence of the political world around them, the socio-political world around them, cascades into the family and is mirrored in the family. And they are working under the most difficult conditions in helping these families build peace, in helping the schools build peace where students are difficult, rather than resorting to to older patriarchal means of hitting the child that hits, to deter. And in a sense, our colleagues in Gaza who are working with NVR in families and in schools are helping them move away from ideas of deterrence or from retaliation that is often masked, vengeance that is masked as deterrence. Deterrence is based on assumptions of a zero-sum game of winning and losing. I must win so that you lose and you do not win over me. Those are the words that we hear currently. When actually any zero-sum game playing comes back to bite the player and unfortunately to bite others around them. So there is a necessity in peace building to also move away, I believe, from the idea that deterrence, which is often, like I said, a masked form of vengeance, works. Unless you eradicate the other. Zero-sum games do not work in the end. Escalation in the long run carries on.
And what you're reminding me of, thank you, Peter, for raising the great work that's being done by Producers for Hope and Peace and our Gaza colleagues who are working really tirelessly with families using NVR, is their real courage and determination to bring these ideas to the families that they're working with, to create a shift in the next generation. 50% of Gaza are under the age of 18, I believe.
Yeah.
So there is a really young population who exists within a context where retaliation is rife.
Yeah.
And how our colleagues there continue to be able to tell stories of their attempts to resist these retaliation. We know that they are taking care of their own children. They're trying to keep themselves safe. But we also send them unbounded, not just empathy, but compassion, because compassion energizes and drives to keep the torch alive of peace building.
Yes. I mean, I guess I was speaking with a friend and colleague the other day who raised the question is this not a tiny light in this darkness? And is it worth it? And I was speaking with another friend yesterday who said, well, it's not quantitative. So in darkness, even a tiny light shines powerfully. And I think it's very important to, particularly in these dark days where, I'm thinking of our friends in Gaza, and I'm actually thinking of whether they will survive.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of friends in Israel whose children may be called up as reservists. It's such a darkness. But I believe that not in a utopian sense, not in the sense that we can bring about world peace, but that it's simply right. And what our colleagues are doing is simply right, even if it is just a small light.
Yeah.
I was what's also gone through my mind is dignity and human dignity. And again, this image of the men sitting on the dead body of this young woman will not leave my mind, that extreme violation of human dignity. And being of German descent, I'm very mindful of the greatest horrors, I guess, in human history perpetrated by the German nation, and how forged in that crucible there's the preamble of the German Constitution states that human dignity is inviolable. It's an aspiration, but I think it must organize our thoughts in what we do.
I think this conversation has. I think it's been a moment of pause, really, and we talk about kind of the silence, and I hope for our listeners, this moment of pausing and this conversation can help people to feel some of this, because we can and be touched by it and feel some of the sorrow and the tears, because I feel it right now as we're talking. And that by feeling that and not being numbed to this atrocity, we can call to action again.
Yeah. You're also descended from people from a country that has seen such horror.
And as we were talking, I was thinking that this is something that will resonate for many of our families across the world and in the UK, with the atrocities of being colonised by other countries. And so to bear witness to that in yourself. And I do think that contemplation, silence, connecting with dignity and hope and peace building, even if it's just a glimmer to get through these dark times.
It's all we can do.
So it's goodbye from me.
And from me.